All right, I think we'll get started. We're going to talk about debugging your website with Fiddler and Chrome Developer tools. A little bit about myself. So I've been a web developer since 1995. I work full-time for an e-commerce site, and then I do conference speaking and Pluralsight videos as well. Got my email, my Twitter, and my blog information up there. So if you need to get a hold of me at some point, you can reach out via those. So we'll dive right in. We're going to talk about HTTP today. So HTTP is the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. I gave you the two links to the two current versions, HTTP 1.1 and HTTP 2. That's what we're going to focus on when we're looking at our web troubleshooting. It's a request and response paradigm. And I put an asterisk after that. There is a feature in HTTP 2 called server push. That will be the first time that servers are actually initiating connections to clients. But in general, the client will make a request, the server's going to respond. Each one of the requests and responses is going to have a header with just meta information about that request or response, along with the body that has the actual content. So I do a lot of mentoring for new web developers, and so I like to show them what an actual GET request looks like in case they haven't seen one on the wire. I think it helps answer questions they might have about, do I know client resolution? Do I know how many colors the client supports? No, I mean, this is all that gets sent up from a client to a server. As far as when the server's going to make decisions, this is all that it's going to see. So a typical request will have a GET. So I want to retrieve something from this URL. In this case, the client is specifying it wants to use HTTP 1.1. These are the other headers that get transmitted along, and we'll look at these as we go, but accept language is just saying this is the language I have my browser configured for. So if you happen to have a multilingual website, that's how the server knows what language to respond with. We'll see the user agent as we go through some stuff. Everybody lies, right? They have all sorts of things in there that they really aren't. But just to advertise, usually there's one thing you can key into to tell you what that specific browser is. I don't personally do a lot of browser sniffing on servers, but if you need to take advantage of that for some reason. We'll talk about encoding later when we get into performance. That just says the client supports compression, and the host header lets the server know which of the particular sites it needs to route to. So if you're using IIS like I am, the host header lets me use a single IP address for all the sites that I have. It actually sees that host header in the request, and it knows which one of the IIS sites it needs to serve. Okay? So that's what a basic GET request looks like. If we look at a typical response, we'll see the server did indeed say it'll use HTTP 1.1. 200 just means that everything went okay. There's a whole list of all the different status codes. It has the date on here of when the response was. I see we're being kind to hackers here, right? We're telling them exactly what we run. Usually it's nice to give them a version number to it to kind of save some time. But it's also saying how long it wants you to keep it in the cache. So we'll talk about expirations later. And again, just some more headers talking about what's here, how big the content is, a blank line, and then the actual body for that content. So that's the typical request-response paradigm we're going to look at in the tools that we're using. By the way, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt. We do have a microphone, so we get it on the recording, so just raise your hand, and we'll go as we go. So we'll start with what is Fiddler. So Fiddler is a tracing tool that was built specifically for HTTP. So Eric Lawrence was working at Microsoft. I think he was on the clip art team. And people would call in, customers would call in and say, we ordered clip art, we can't download it. And he was listening to his own customer service people try to help them, and there were no good tools around to try to help troubleshoot what's going wrong, why doesn't this download. So back then, Microsoft had Netmon, which is similar to Wireshark. I don't know if you use any of those, but it does work. It's a packet tracing tool. It's not very fun to look through that tool and try to reassemble the full GET and the full response. So he said, I want to make a super simple tool specifically for HTTP that makes it as easy as what you just saw. Here's the full request. Here's the full response. So he worked on that part-time when he was at Microsoft. He decided that he wanted to work on it full-time. So he asked Microsoft, will you allow me to work on this full-time? And they said no. So he started looking for some other partners that might be interested, and he actually was acquired by Telerik in 2012. So he became a full-time employee with Telerik, and I think he worked there 3 years, and now he's moved on to work at Chrome. So Telerik now owns Fiddler. They promised to keep it free, and they've been doing a lot of innovations lately, so they're the people who currently own it. You can download it from fiddler2.com. It is free. It's written in C#, so we'll talk about some of the .NET stuff potentially as we get into it, but I think it's cool that he said he didn't know HTTP, he didn't know .NET, he didn't know C#, and he went and learned all that and wrote Fiddler, which is pretty impressive. On the side. I mean, it's what he did on weekends and stuff over whatever it was, 10 to 13 years from when he started. So I've used it for a long time. It's a really great tool. So we'll just show the basics of how we're going to run this. So I'm going to start up Fiddler. We go into Chrome and just pick the conference website. And I have some of it cached, so I'm just going to remove all. I'm going to hit Control F5 in Chrome to force it to refresh. And then we'll just watch all the requests. So this is the other thing I like to show web developers, and I occasionally will show this to my marketing group too, just to show them that it's not a single request between the client and the server to get a web page. There's a lot of requests. I'll show you HTTP archive if we have time later. The average web page today is about 105 requests. I think it's up to 2.5 meg, the average web page, which, like I said, I've been doing this for a long time. That kind of freaks me out. That's as big as the Doom program used to be. So if you ever used to play Doom on a PC, your installer, average web page is actually bigger than that now, just to give you an idea of context, and you'll see it grow over the years. But inside of Fiddler, what we'll look at is, on the left-hand side, these are all the requests that were made. So it made the HTML request, and I'm going to go on the right-hand side here. I just like looking at the raw request. I'll pop it in the notepad so you can see it better, but that looks like what we looked at before. So that's just my client asking for the home page on that particular host. I'm going to take this off. You'll see this little, I don't know how well it shows up, this gold bar here that says that the response body is encoded. It's actually compressed, which is a good thing. So I'm going to take that off, and we'll look at the raw response. And you'll see the same thing. It's got all the same headers, and then the actual body for the HTML that came down. Okay? And then all of these additional requests are all the JavaScript, the CSS, all the images that make up that page are all downloaded, and we can look at those individually, and we'll look at that as we go through this talk. Again, you can get it from Fiddler 2. There's a lot of different things out here. They actually have some pretty good documentation. They have some videos out here as well. And they've got different areas that you might want to use Fiddler for, and they walk through that. They've now also got, so the normal download was 4.net. They also have a beta that runs on Mono, and they just put out a beta for OS X. So we'll talk a little bit later about how you can troubleshoot devices other than Windows, but just be aware that those are out there as well. So you can just come and download that. So how does Fiddler work? So I talked about Wireshark and Netmon. Those kind of network monitoring programs are sitting on a wireless adapter or your network adapter, and they're just intercepting all the calls that go through that particular adapter. That's not how Fiddler works. Fiddler is actually set up as it's a separate application, and you're going to set it up via a proxy. So if you're familiar, most companies have a proxy server that all your computers will connect to get out to the internet. The idea with this is whatever client I'm using, I need to configure its proxy to point at where Fiddler is. That way all that stuff will get sent through Fiddler and can get traced. Okay? So what Fiddler does by default, as soon as I open Fiddler, it's going to look for all the open browser instances that I have, and it will actually go in and change their configuration to route through Fiddler. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. It becomes important later when we talk about tracing different clients and stuff that you understand that it goes through a proxy. So I've got Fiddler running right here. If I open Chrome, we go look at the settings. We'll go down to advanced. It's got change proxy settings. So if I come in here, it's got use a proxy server. So if you've ever seen the shirt, there's no place like 127.0.0.1. Yeah, no place like home. This points to your own machine. So this points to localhost. So what it's done is it says Fiddler's running on port 8888 on this machine. So I'm going to set my proxy to point at this machine and that port. Now everything I'm doing in that browser is being routed through Fiddler. Okay? So that's how Fiddler's actually getting set up, and that's how it sees all of that traffic. Kind of freaked out our security group at first. They weren't happy to have Netmon or Wireshark people running it, especially when we were all on switches before, because you could watch everybody else's network traffic. That's not a good thing. With Fiddler, you have to specifically route your proxy to go through Fiddler to be able to see anything, so you don't have that risk that you're going to be looking at things from other people's machines. Okay? And as we go through the talk, I'm going to focus, so I support an e-commerce site. I have a lot of different clients I have to worry about, a lot of different devices that have problems. I tend to use Fiddler first because it gives me consistency. So if it's something I can do in Fiddler, I'm going to do it in Fiddler. There's a lot of things that I can't do in Fiddler that I'm going to fall back, and that's what I'll show you in Chrome Developer Tools. So it doesn't mean that it's not in Chrome Developer Tools. It's just if I can do it in Fiddler, then it's consistent for me across all these different devices. It's just easier for me to troubleshoot that way. Okay? Talk about Chrome Developer Tools. So I can hit F12 when I'm in Chrome to get into Developer Tools, or you can use the Windows or Mac keyboard sequences. When it comes to Developer Tools, there are flags you can set. So you can actually go to Chrome Flags, and if you scroll down, there'll be a spot I can check that says, I want to use experimental developer tool things. None of the things I'm going to show you in this talk depend on that. If you happen to run into something where you see that's a cool feature, they may tell you to go there and enable it because it's not enabled by default for everybody. But like I said, none of the things I'm going to show you are going to do that. You could also get Canary. So Canary is meant for developers and early adopters that want to see new features that are potentially going to make it into Chrome itself. You can download Canary and you can run it side by side. Again, I'm not going to show you anything in Canary here. Everything I'm going to show you is something that works in shipping Chrome. And I want to do that because I have to troubleshoot on other people's machines. I want to be able to use techniques that I know are going to be available if they have Chrome. Okay? But if you see things, you can use one of those. So I'm going to try to focus on different areas for the talk. I'm going to start with your site is failing and you don't know why, and break it down into some different categories. Show some simple examples from each one and how these tools can help you troubleshoot problems that you're having. So the very first one is somebody will come to me and say their site's not working. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open Fiddler and I'm going to check all of the response status codes that come back because that is very often where I start realizing where their problem is. So I have a web page. I can pull it up in the browser. I'm just going to clear, by the way. I'm just going to say remove all to say less in here. So I'm going to pull up this particular page. And right away I see it's not what I expect. So this is Bootstrap. I expected the top to have a carousel that showed me some of the different cities. It's a fictitious travel site. And I can tell right away that something's not working with this. So like I said, the first thing I'll do when somebody says stuff doesn't work, I want to make sure that all of the files and stuff they need are being pulled down correctly. So in this case, I can look through, here's the request for the actual page, and right away, nicely highlighted in red, if it were only this simple all the time, right? That's my problem. The CSS style sheet that is controlling a lot of that look and feel for that page isn't correct, right? I can see that that file's not being downloaded. It's not very typical on your own machine, but how many times do you go to somebody else's and they said, well, it all worked on my machine. Doesn't work when I got to stage. And so I'll start asking, did you deploy this? Did you move? Somebody couldn't get their video to play. Did you deploy everything? Yep. Go do this. Boom. The video file wasn't deployed where it's supposed to be. You get a 404. It's very easy to fix that way. So now that I see this, I'm going to show you this in Chrome as well, but I know that that's probably what the problem is. So here again, I'm going to hit F12. They have a network tab here as well. I'll slide it up just a hair here. So if I go Control F5, hit this request again, and then if I scroll up in here, I can see the same thing, that style sheet. For whatever reason, that's not being pulled down like it should be. Nice thing I can do in Chrome if I want to, I can come into here. It turns out that I know that that's not the right style sheet name. So somebody mistyped it. Shouldn't be site 1, should be just site. Could be that I deployed it wrong. It could be the server's not working. So nice thing is I can come right here and change it, hit enter, and I can see immediately that now I get the experience I wanted. So I haven't had to go back into the development environment. I can do a lot of stuff in the client, make adjustments, see did that fix it or not fix it. I can go then to the sources tab if I want. And see if I can see my list here. There's a way in here I can tell, it shows me that that's been modified on the client. And usually on here I'll see my CSS file. And then I can actually just right click and save it. Another thing I can do, I'm not going to show in here, there's a feature called workspaces. So you can actually set up a workspace in Chrome to point to the folder. So on my own development machine, I can actually point to where the source code is. So I could make changes on the fly in the CSS like that. I can say save, and I can actually push it directly to the folder where that CSS file sits. Now, I do SAS and stuff in production, and I do bundling and minification, so that doesn't work out well for the way that I do development. But if you want to, just be aware that you can make changes within the browser and actually push it via workspaces. Okay? So again, if I now know that that's the problem, I can come back in here, I can change this, save it. If we go execute that again, now that change is going to be permanent because it's not just in developer tools, and then everything works like I would expect, and I'm happy. Okay, so you'd be surprised how often it is, especially with people using CDNs and third-party components and stuff. It's just a missing file or something not deployed right. That's a really quick way to test and see that that's the problem. Next one we'll talk about is JavaScript errors. So I've got a JavaScript file. Let's pull this one up. And what I expect for this one is I've got an image on it, and I want to be able to click the image and have it do a modal dialog box that shows me like a zoomed in picture from this. So if I can click on this, I can see I'm using Bootstrap. I get the modal to pop up, but it doesn't have the picture embedded or anything like I would expect. This is going to be a good case to use developer tools for, and so I'm going to use Chrome Developer Tools and try to troubleshoot this. I could just try to step through line by line until I finally get to where I think the problem is. It's a lot easier in Chrome. I can just actually set, here's my on click where I know the code is here that I want it to run. I can actually just type debugger. And if I save that, now what's going to happen is when I go re-execute this, when I get to the case where this actually fires, I can get my thing to come up here. Why are you not behaving? When in doubt, shut it down. So I'm just going to control F5, make sure I have the recent copy. Hit F12. Now if I scroll down here, I should be able to click this, and you'll see it immediately paused in the debugger. So it hit my debugger statement, and it's now sitting directly where I am on that on click. So it just saved me time to get to where I was. So now I'm going to hit F11 and start going into that file. The first thing you'll notice is I do minification and bundling and stuff, so that's all minified, all the white space is gone. That's not very entertaining when you're trying to do client-side troubleshooting. So if you know there's this pretty print in the bottom, so I can actually just say I want that to be unminified, if that's a word. We'll use that as a word today. So now it's unminified. It's not back to the original source. You can see it's got things like R. That isn't what I named things. That's just how some of the minification occurred. You can look at source maps and other things to try to get you back to the original source. But now I can actually start stepping through here on the client. So next thing you notice, I'm going into jQuery. So I'm using jQuery for this. I'm using it in Bootstrap. Not very often when I'm troubleshooting is there actually going to be a problem in the jQuery library. In fact, I've used it for years. I've never personally run into a library problem. So I don't really want to troubleshoot in jQuery. I can simply right-click and say black box this script. When I do that, what it's saying is it's now going to save that in my configuration. Every time I do client-side debugging and it's about to go to jQuery, it's going to skip over all of the jQuery code, so I don't have to spend time wasted looking through the jQuery stuff. So I'm going to come out of this. Another thing you'll notice, it's giving me variable details. So instead of having to hover like I do in Visual Studio to be able to see what some of the variable contents are, it's actually displaying it to the side. So there's actually a feature that's on by default, but if you didn't like it, you can turn it off. Display variable values in line while debugging. That's what's giving me the feature that it's showing me as I'm stepping here, each line, and you'll see as I go to the next one, it's showing me all the values next to it. That's where that feature comes from. So as I'm looking and troubleshooting this, I won't spend a lot of time on this. It turns out that I'm using children, and if I look at my markup, it's not a direct descendant child. I'm trying to find some content that's further down. So I'm trying to find the title and the body of this. So I've got this modal. I want to get down into these things and start playing with that in the DOM. Children isn't actually what I should be using. So I went out and looked at the jQuery documentation. It turns out to be find instead of children, so I can fix that. Another thing that I'd like to do on the server side, I can actually set, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I just want to tell you that it's there. So I can do things like console assert, or I can do traces or warning or debug. All of those things are going to get put out into the console for the developer tools. So in this case, if I were concerned, I want to make sure that when I do the children, I get back something that's at least length greater than 0. I can just say I want to assert that. And if I save that and run that again, then I'll actually go click on this again. I'm paused in the debugger again. So now if I step in here, I'm going to do the pretty print. Now if I open up the console, I can hit escape, and the console will open here. So it should show me, unless it already tried, right there. There's my assertion. So I can put all of these things in my JavaScript to tell me these are things that are happening on the client. And there's a ton of things in Chrome, and all the other developer tools are pretty well standardized on what's in the console. So you can just go out here and search for the console reference under Chrome in this case, but it shows you all the things you can do with assertions. You can serialize objects into the console so you can see all of their contents, do tracing, see stack traces, etc. So those are all things I can add into my JavaScript. And when it comes to the minification, the pretty print is handy, but I don't like to do that if I have a lot of different JavaScript files. That's where Fiddler can help. It actually has a feature called Make JavaScript Pretty. If I do that and click it here, because Fiddler is a proxy between my client and my server, it's intercepting all of the requests. It can actually make modifications. So it's going to see all the minified JavaScript files come back from the server and actually unminify them there and send them down to the client so that I don't have to look through and keep hitting pretty print. So if I hit this again, now if I hit F12 and I want to do troubleshooting, I can look under the sources. Let me close this. I can look at all the things that say they're minified here. You can see actually now are unminified, and I can do all my troubleshooting the way that I want to. So if you do a lot of this and you don't want to have to hit pretty print, just be aware that you can come in here and change it. And then Fiddler notifies you which files it actually modified by doing some color coding to it, just so you have an idea. Next thing we'll talk about is style issues. So we get a lot of CSS styles we have to apply from third party and other people, and of course when they have their ads and whatever they want to put in, everything works perfect, right? I mean, it all lays out right and everything's okay. I put it into our e-commerce site. Things don't work the way that they should. So I want to be able to troubleshoot issues that I have with those styles. So again, we'll do this in the Chrome Developer Tools. So I've got my page. I'm going to shut this. Now what I can do is I look at this, and for whatever reason I didn't expect this to be the color green. So the fast way to get to DevTools and see exactly where this is, I can just right click and say I need to inspect that particular element. Now it's going to bring down below, it'll bring me to the Styles tab. So here I can see all of the CSS style rules that were applied to that particular element, and then I can make modifications to see if I want to change anything. So for instance, I can see the reason I'm getting green here, it's coming from custom CSS. That's the file that rule came from. If I want to, I can simply say I want to turn that off and see what other style would apply. It turns out I didn't have any other styles in here, so it fell back to what the browser default would be. But if you see, it slashes out things that other rules take over. So it's very handy to come in here and say, yeah, I know I've got all these style rules, and this one should be working, but it's struck out because some other rule ended up winning. And then you can troubleshoot, why is that rule? If you've ever looked at like CSS, I hate this word, specificity. Hey, I actually said it right, specificity. very specific rules about how things get applied. So if it turns out, at least I can see that it was struck out, and I can go figure out and try to understand which rule is applying here and why. The other thing I can do is I can come here and actually change the color. So they have a nice color picker. I can just type this by hand if I want. I'm not a designer, so I'll do orange. But I can make those changes on the client on the fly. They also have where they have autocomplete. So if I want to make a new rule here, I can just start typing like maybe this is really foreground color or back color that I want to change. You can see it's giving me autocomplete or type ahead, so it's got nice features for that. Some of the other things that I can do in here is that if I have some particular style rules on hover, so let's say I want to go and look at this element again. I happen to have a hover rule. I can actually come here and say I want to force that into a hover state. So now when I do that, I had expected it to be another color. I've got another style in there for hover, I think. I'll do this one. Control F5. See, now I'm targeting this. If we go back here, you can see, well, in this case, it's applying, sorry for the resolution here. This is some of the strikeout stuff I was showing, where it just shows this rule now overrode the other one because it's targeting a specific ID. If you don't want to look at the style where you see all those strikeouts, you can actually go to computed, and it's just going to show you all the actual properties and all of their values. So if you don't really care which rule is it that made it this way, but you want to see what it is, or you want to edit it, you can do that directly here. Okay? So like I said, we use this a lot. This is how we find style problems because otherwise it's just not very entertaining. This is a good way for me to client-side troubleshoot that stuff. And then they also have the box model that I can play with. But that's the core thing that we'll do is under the Styles tab, just try to troubleshoot what's wrong with our styles. Next one is performance concerns. So I have a lot of people, I do a lot of web performance work that will say, my site's not working, I want to understand why. So we'll talk about ways to troubleshoot that. So I'm going to open up Fiddler here. We'll go back to the conference website. I'm going to clear all of them and just do a refresh. So I'm just doing a Control F5, which is forcing all those requests to get remade. So if anything was cached on the client, I want to see all the requests that go on an initial. So there's a lot of things I can do in here. Because I've done a lot of web performance work, I kind of know what to look for, so I'm just going to tip you off to things that they should be doing or ways to investigate where the problem usually is. So we'll start here. The first thing I'll look at is the HTML that comes back. I do notice that it's compressed, so if you don't use HTTP compression on your web servers, you should. We turned it on our e-commerce site like 10 years ago, and it cut our bandwidth usage in half. So it's free, it's built into all the web servers. All of your static files, you should do compression. We use it for all of our dynamic files as well, so it's good that they're doing that. If I look at their CSS file, I'm going to take that off and just look. It looks like they have it minified, which is good. That's the best practice. We'll do the same for the JavaScript. Take this off. Let's see if that's minified as well. So they're doing minification. You notice, though, they're not doing any bundling. So they actually have 5 or 6 separate JavaScript files. So we minified and we take all of our JavaScript files and put them into a single bundle with a version number every time we do a build. And that also cut our homepage time in half. It just makes that big of a difference because when you looked at Fiddler, all of these requests have to go back and forth between your client and your server, potentially over a slow network. The less things that you have to transmit where you're doing that back and forth over that latency, the better. So that's something they should do. Next thing I'll typically do is I'll sort by the body just to see what the biggest files are. So we can see that Scott Allen is being a hog at 285K. So the first thing I noticed by looking at this, that's pretty big for an image. And it's a PNG, which strikes me as odd. I mean, photos should really be JPEGs, not PNGs. So I can quickly go out. First thing I'll do is I'll save off this image. So I can actually just say I want to save the response body. So I'm going to just save that on the desktop. I happen to use PaintShop Pro. There's a lot of other tools to do editing of images, but I'm going to go open up that file. And just by saving it as a JPEG, one of the things they have in here, they have an optimizer. So I can actually do a side-by-side. In JPEG, you can do compression and trade off quality for size. So I'm just going to start changing the quality. Let's see, if I put it at 90, it's going to tell me it'll get down to 18K, but you'll see now it's got some artifacts in there. So I'd probably back off to like 75. Yeah, he still looks decent there, so we'll do that. I'm going to save this to the desktop as well. And if we go do a quick compare, that's 24K instead of 288 some K. So it's just a tip off when you can see things like this quickly. You can see it's PNGs when it really shouldn't be. They're really big. And then the other thing I noticed is I'm not in this list. All these other guys, I'm not in there. So anyways, but that's some of the quick performance things that you can do in Fiddler. If you know some of the performance rules, you can just look through for specific things that you know. The other one that's slightly off the screen here is caching. So by default, somebody comes to my homepage, gets my HTML, I list out all my CSS, JavaScript, and images, it downloads them all, they close the browser, they come back tomorrow. What I'd like to do is, if I haven't changed any of those things, I'd like to have it served right off their own machine. I mean, it's sitting in their browser cache on their machine. It's never going to get faster than to use that. If you don't set expirations on your content to tell it how long this stuff is considered fresh, your browser has to guess. And a lot of times it's going to go back to the server and say, I have a file I got yesterday. Has it been changed since then? And since you have 104 requests or whatever on a typical web page, that's 104 trips back to your web server to find out that nothing actually changed. So we set expirations for all of our images for 30 days. Our JavaScript and CSS we do for a year because we have version numbers built into them. That way when you come and revisit tomorrow, you don't have to download any of those images again. Okay? If it turns out I really have to change the logo, I'll just change the name to logo1.jpg instead of logo, and everybody won't have that in their browser, and they'll come back and get it. So the other thing I notice on here, they're not using a lot of caching for things like all of those pictures for the speakers. So if I come back later, it's up to my browser. I don't want to leave it up to the browser to decide if it's going to go ask again. I want to set expirations, and that's something else that's missing on there. So that's some quick performance things. The other things you can do in Chrome DevTools, they have an audits tab. So if you're not real familiar with the performance rules and you just want to get a rough assessment of your page, you can actually come in here and say, I want to run a web page performance audit. And it's actually going to spit out things that it thinks that you should do. So if I look at some of these, it's just going to say I've got all these images I don't have dimensions specified for. It tells me I can minimize my cookie size, things like that. Usually this comes up with more specifics. Oh, here they are. Sorry, they're at the bottom. Remove some of the unused CSS rules. It'll look at your images and tell you if you could make them smaller by doing some compression on them. So that's pretty decent. I'm going to cheat one time in my talk and go outside of DevTools and the other one because they used to have this in DevTools and they took it out. Chrome has a page speed insights. I can actually go punch in a URL and it'll do a mobile and desktop performance analysis for me and break down things that I should fix. So it's similar to the auditing. It just has more capabilities than what's built into DevTools. So again, I can come out here and see here are a bunch of different images that they basically took every image, compressed it, and said, I think you could do better on your size by doing more compression of these images. Okay? So again, just a nice tool to be able to get a sense for how your performance is. Mixed content warning. So if you happen to have a site that's not completely HTTPS, somebody gives you some of their content, or even if you are, they give you content that's not using HTTPS, and you get that mixed content warning that's annoying. It's very easy to find that in Chrome. So I can pull up the page, I'll hit F12. I'm going to re-request this. I'm going to go to the security tab and hit Control F5. And what it'll say is they've broken it into a specific area where it says you have a particular resource on here that's not being requested correctly. And I can see it's London JPEG on mixed content.htm. You can see right here it's referencing it with HTTP:, even though it's a HTTPS page. You shouldn't do that. I've used what's called protocol-less links for a while. So I can actually go back to this page on the server here. And instead of referencing that like this, I can leave off the protocol. That'll actually say, I don't care if you're HTTPS or HTTP, match the protocol the page is using to make this request. So now when it's on an HTTPS page like this one, if I hit Control F5 again, it's going to request, and now everything's green, everybody's happy, and I don't get that mixed content warning like I would get in IE. And it's not easy to find these. With other things, it's nice that that's easy to do if you're in Chrome Developer Tools. Also, the next thing is always compare a success and failure. So we have a lot of cases where something doesn't work. So we own a lot of different food companies. So you could go and find where to buy our pizza, and would use HTML5 geolocation on the client, and it'd figure out your lat long, and then we'd plot out all of the different places you could buy our product. And it worked fine. Somebody did something, of course, and suddenly it didn't work anymore, but only on iPhones it didn't work. So we did some tracing with our various tools, and we couldn't spot it. So what I did is I actually pulled up a Fiddler trace of one that worked. So I knew that Edge worked. Let's see if I can zoom in here at all. Come on. Oops. See, here's the lat. And I just looked at this and said, okay, this is one that works. I don't know why this one works. And then I pulled up one that didn't work. So I pulled up a trace of an iPhone. And the thing I noticed was the precision from the iPhone was much more decimal points than the one on the other one. I mean, I had looked at it for days, and I couldn't figure out what was different. When I did the trace of the two of them and then can look at the request and Fiddler side by side, it became immediately obvious that this had a lot more precision. Turns out somebody swapped out our back end to a different tool, and that one could not handle that many decimals of precision. It was dying. So the point of it is, if you're running into things you can't troubleshoot, take a working and a non-working, and then eyeball the two of them side by side, because then you can often see what's different about the two and be able to figure it out. Now, who's doing that? Often have pages where you think it's going to look one way, but somebody is changing it. So I've got an example of a page. So I've got a page, it looks great. This has got a little time delay on it. So I'm sitting here maybe reviewing this page and said, yeah, that's exactly what I expect. And then suddenly, there we go. And I think, why did that happen? Who just made a modification to this? And trying to figure out through all of our JavaScript and third-party stuff we use, who did that is not very entertaining. What I can do is I can say inspect. Now I'm on that particular area. I can right-click and say, please break on subtree modifications or attribute modifications. So now if I run this again, what it's going to do, it's got a timer in there to sleep, but after about 10 or 15 seconds, it's going to find, as soon as that thing gets modified, it's going to pop me into the debugger on the client, and it's going to give me a stack trace to who actually made that call. So there I got the pop, and then here, there's the code right there. So now I can go look and say, I don't know why somebody did this, but they're specifically changing the class on this attribute, and they're changing the HTML. So again, when you have a lot of moving parts, it's hard to see who's actually making changes to your DOM. You can actually just say that break on, and it'll target and pause directly on who made that modification. Okay? Next one is, I flipped those around, sorry. Who requested that? So there's a lot of times where somebody will come to us and say, we did a Fiddler trace, there's this JavaScript file in there we didn't expect, or I'm going to show you an example of a font. How do you figure out who actually made that request? So go back to Fiddler. I'm going to clear this out. So I made a request, and let's say in this scenario we're using web fonts. We have corporate stance on what the font's supposed to be. They're not using the corporate font, so now we're getting an extra download we don't want. Who's doing that? Why is that getting pulled in? So Fiddler does have a searching tool. I can find sessions. The important thing is this. I used the tool forever, and I never knew what that setting was, and I was searching. If you have compressed content, the search wasn't actually looking into any of the compressed content. So I would never get matches in the tool, and I thought the find just sucked, and I didn't know why. If you check this, anything that's actually compressed now will get uncompressed, and you should be doing compression, so you just set that. If you do find sessions, now it shows me Bootstrap is the one that's pulling that in. So now I can go into the Bootstrap file. So it just helps me figure out, again, when you have a lot of third-party libraries and such, who's pulling in this extra file or why is this getting used? It's a quick way for me to troubleshoot and see where that is. There's another place. It's in Developer Tools. I will admit that this is a little flaky and doesn't always work. So I'm just going to show you it not working, so you believe me. You can actually see there's an initiator column right here that tells you who is it that drove this request. So in this initiator, that should point directly at who requested that file. So if I go to this halflings right here, it says it's Bootstrap line 153, but if I click that, it's actually jQuery file, which isn't correct. I just want you to know if you're stuck, sometimes initiator is correct, and sometimes it saves you a ton of time. Just be aware that it's not always right. Okay? It's a little flaky. But that's a good way to pinpoint who's making requests to that particular file. The next branch of things we're going to look at is what if. So what if I did certain things? How would things be different? So the first thing is, what if the request was different? So because Fiddler is acting as a proxy, it can actually intercept all of the requests between the client and the server and allow me to make modifications. So I've got a simple page here. It's supposed to do validation, so if I hit 1, it says, hey, that's great. If I hit 0, I have client-side JavaScript saying that, that's not valid. Everybody knows client-side JavaScript does nothing for real security, right? I mean, it's just a user interface or interaction thing. So what I want to see is did the server person do it correctly? Will this work if JavaScript's not enabled? A real fast way to do that, there's a Composer tab. I think somebody showed me that was using this in an earlier demo today too. If I drag this guy over and drop it, it's going to have the request that I made. So let me pull the other one because I want the post. So here's my successful post when I posted. When I was posting the value 1 in the text box. I'm going to just change that. So literally I can change anything in the request and send it to the server. This isn't always easy to do. It's super easy in Fiddler. So I'll say go re-execute that. Then I can look at that. I'll go look at what its response was. And you can see the value is 0. It shouldn't be doing that, right? It shouldn't have gone to the server and allowed that to occur. So the people on the server are not doing validation the way they're supposed to. And that was a fast way to find it. Another thing I can do with this, if I go back to Composer, like I said, I can change literally anything in here. So if I drag this request over, I can play with what if the client doesn't support compression? Is my server responding correctly? So I can execute that. Go back to the response. You'll see there's no gold bar here. It's not compressed anymore. So we use this a lot for doing various security testing and stuff. It's faster than writing a client that can make up headers and things. I can just drag those requests over and change them as I want. Okay? What if something was blocked? So if we go into, we'll do this one in Fiddler. You can actually go into, they have a bunch of filters. So I can actually just say, what happens if my CSS files get blocked? So I'm going to click, if I can get it to click here. I'm going to go request my Bootstrap page again. I'm going to hit Control F5. Voila, it looks like that. Not a huge surprise. But we actually, when we bundled all of our CSS files and we put them out on our CDN, and like 2 days after I did that, my CDN had a hiccup and everybody saw this. So I learned how to write fallback code, which I wish I would have known before that happened. So you can actually write code to see the CSS didn't get downloaded. So instead of pulling it from the CDN, pull it off my own server instead. So I have that type of code now. This is a way for me to test then what happens if that request doesn't work. That's kind of a heavy hammer, so there's another way to do this as well. I can take individual files. Let me clear this. I'm going to make a request. The other thing I can do is there's an autoresponder tab. So I can actually drag, I can say I don't want all CSS to go away. I just have a particular CSS from a CDN or something. I just want to see what happens if it gets a 404. I can drag that over to the autoresponder. Now I can, because it's a proxy, every time the client tries to ask for that file, I can now intercept and tell it do something else. So I'm going to enable rules. I'm going to let all unmatched requests pass through to the server because I don't want to mock them all. I just want to do this one. But if I get this one, I want to see what would happen if I get a 404. So I'm going to save that. And if I go back and run this, you'll see what we saw before, right? The carousel's gone. Without that style sheet, this is what happens. So I can use this to troubleshoot, like, what happens when a web font is slow. So not only can I block it, I can come in here and put a delay like this one of 20 seconds. And I can actually see if Bootstrap CSS doesn't download, I have a blank page, right? If I move stuff around, I might be able to get my important styles above that so that I'm sure if Bootstrap is slow, at least I get some basic rendering of my page. I can do that kind of stuff by using autoresponder and targeting specific requests. Okay? What if I'm on a slow connection? So if I'm on a slow connection, we'll do this one in DevTools. They've added the ability to do throttling. So I can actually come down here and say, I want to act like I'm on a 2G connection. Now I'll go up here and hit Control F5, and we'll see how long that takes to paint and all the images and stuff if I'm on 2G. So it's just a way for me to quickly simulate. I want to see how this page is going to run on various levels of connections. You can do that just by setting this throttling here. And again, I can set my own custom for what I want the latency to be and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of a cool feature. What if I have another user agent? So I'm going to skip that given time, but you can spoof out what your user agent is if you want to. So you can go either into Fiddler or in DevTools and say, I'm not really Chrome, I'm really iPhone 6. And then you can see, from a client perspective, how is the server going to react to me telling it that I'm a different type of browser or device? Okay. How do things work on a first request? So browsers are caching things. The quick way in Fiddler to do this, I can actually just come in here and say clear cache. That will clear IE's cache. So now when I go into IE, it's going to force it to do that. If you go into Developer Tools, there's a setting by default that just says disable cache while DevTools is open. So if I do this request, let's go up here. First I'll do it where DevTools is closed, since we just went to that page. If I just hit a normal refresh here, it should just ask for the bootstrap and probably nothing else. Okay. If I pull up DevTools, now that I have DevTools open and I have that setting, if I do that same refresh, you'll see it actually requested all of the particular files. So it's just a way to be aware if you have DevTools open, it's going to act like it's a clean cache situation. The other way that we'll do this occasionally is go into like incognito or in private. We'll also act like you don't have any browser cache. So if you want to see what happens on a first visit, that's the easiest way is to do that. You can simulate different latlongs. So like I said, when I was testing for where to buy our pizzas, I can actually put in specific latlongs. You can also change the orientation of your simulated device. So in DevTools here, if you look at this device toolbar, if I click that, here's where I can choose. They do some basic emulation. So they know like what would this basically look like on an iPhone or an iPad, just to give you a feeling, or you can set it to responsive and change it. But I can also come down here and say I want to do more tools, sensors. And I can actually put in a latlong, or I can actually play with the orientation. So I can actually grab that device and act like I'm turning it anyway. Now, I don't write websites that are changing by, I might do like side to side, so I can do orientation like that. I don't do stuff that's spinning on axes and such, but if you need to do that, that's a cool feature that's in here. Or like I said, if you need to spoof out a different latlong just to see what it looks like when you're coming from somewhere else, you could do that as well. Some miscellaneous things. So I talked about Fiddler for now is its stable release runs on Windows. Okay, so I can run it on my development machine, but I have to troubleshoot all sorts of devices, iPhones, any tablets, anything like that I want to do. How would I do that? So the way that I can do that is I set it up on the same Wi-Fi network. So what I do is I typically end up doing it at home. Our security doesn't let me doing this at work. So I get on the same Wi-Fi network with my laptop and whatever device I want to trace. I go onto my laptop. That's where I'm going to run Fiddler. I go under Tools, Connections, and you see this Allow Remote Computers to Connect. So that's going to let connections come into my machine. I'm not going to talk about firewalls and stuff. You may or may not also have to let your firewall let these connections come through. But this is saying I'm running on this machine on port 8888. The next thing I'll do is I'll go run ipconfig on my laptop and figure out the IP address of this machine. Okay. Once I have that info, now I can go on my phone. So I'm going to show you an example. It's not fun setting up an example with on the fly for this, so I did one ahead of time. On the iPhone, you actually go into your wireless settings. Okay? And it's going to be different for all your devices, but if you go into your wireless settings and you scroll to the very bottom, there's a proxy setting. You just set the server to be the IP address of your laptop and port 8888. Now all the traffic that you're doing on that device is now being routed through Fiddler, so I can do all that tracing. Okay? So this works for anything. If I have to help somebody at work on another desktop, I can route it to my machine through Fiddler if I want to do that. So now I can troubleshoot. I've got a trace. Just to show you, here's my iPhone trace that I did. And if we look at the request, let me see if I can find it here. Let me clear that out. We'll do that again. It'll show you all of the iPhone-specific user agent stuff. Right there, the iPhone. So again, this is a way for me to trace. So regardless of the device and the fact that I can or can't run Fiddler on it, as long as I can set a proxy for it and route it through a machine running Fiddler like that, I'm able to get that trace. Talk about back-end APIs. A lot of people expect, so I've got a page here that calls a web service, and I've just got I'll pull it up and show you, converts from Fahrenheit to Celsius. If I can find it. So 212 Fahrenheit to 100 Celsius. So when I did that, if I open up Fiddler, a lot of people expect that you'll see the call from the client to the server. I really wanted to capture the web service call being made by ASP.NET out to a third-party service. If I come in here, I don't see that. And again, the reason is because .NET calls by default within my code are not set through a proxy, like a browser would. I have to specifically either do this, I'll set it and say this call has to go through this proxy, or if you prefer, you can go into web config, and there's a default proxy setting. If I uncomment this, all of the calls from any of the .NET classes will now get routed through Fiddler, so I can trace all my web API, WCF, all that stuff that would normally be from my server-side code going out to other places. I can trace that in Fiddler as well by setting up the proxy for it. But that's why it's important to understand that Fiddler is a proxy, so if you're not seeing it, that's probably why. You can also see HTTPS traffic. Right? This should freak you out a little. The whole point of HTTPS is that you can't see the traffic. Well, you can with Fiddler because it's a proxy, and you can in Chrome DevTools because it's already decrypted. So if I come into here and I go to HTTPS, I just have to say decrypt. I'm not going to do it here, but the first time I do this, Fiddler is going to create its own server certificate. So now when I go on the client and try to go somewhere, Fiddler's going to intercept and give me its server certificate. So on the client, I'm going to see a warning that says, this is not bing.com you're going to. It's do not trust Fiddler. Do you want to trust this certificate? I do, right? I'm intentionally trying to do a trace. I'll add it to my browser safe certificate store. Then for the rest of time, every time I'm debugging, I'll be able to see the HTTPS. So if I go out here and go out to, we'll just go out to Google, since they're using HTTPS. If I go down to their request, which is right here, you can see it uses HTTPS, but if I look on the right and look at the raw, I can actually see all the HTML. So if you need to troubleshoot HTTPS, this is a good way to be able to have Fiddler sit in between and basically decrypt it all for you. Okay? And again, it shouldn't freak you out too much from security because you knew it was a bad certificate, you choose to trust it, it's only on my own machine, but it lets me see all that traffic. I get a lot of calls from people that say, your site's not working on my computer, like even senior vice presidents. I don't want to install Fiddler on a senior vice president machine. I'm going to get blamed when she can't print 3 years from now. It's my fault. So I'm not going to do that. So by default, I'm going to use Chrome DevTools first because I can actually do network trace. And if I do a network trace, let's just do, if I hit F12, I go to the network. This is my best case scenario. I can do all my tracing. And then, come on, I can actually right-click here and say, save as har. It'll save a har file with all of the same requests that I can go import then into Fiddler. And it's got like 95% of the stuff that should be there. It'll look like I captured it in Fiddler even though I didn't, and I didn't have to install anything on their machine, which is good. The other choice would be if I'm near them, I can actually just go configure their proxy to point at my laptop at my desk, just like I was with the iPhone device, and I can route it all through my normal laptop through Fiddler. That makes me happy. There's also a tool called Fiddler Cap. I actually had to send this to a senior VP that was remote that didn't have Chrome. She installed this. All she has to do then is hit Start Capture, go do whatever she wants to do. When she's done, she can hit the I'm done with the capture, please save it. She gives it a name, she emails it to me, and then I open it up in Fiddler and I do all the troubleshooting that I need to do. And it makes things like, please make sure your cache is cleared and your cookies are cleared. All those things are easy for her to do, okay? But I didn't have to, I did have to install something, which is unfortunate, but at least it's something that's easy for a non-technical person to use. We'll talk about some non-optimized images, if I got a second here. So another tool in Fiddler is show image bloat. So this is a third-party thing that you can get off the Fiddler site. I'm going to reestablish my proxy. So if I go run this against the conference site again, it turns out that PNGs have a lot of metadata in them that describe, things about the image that the user doesn't actually see. But if you look, this thing adds bricks to show you how much of the image is actually metadata. So most of this image is actually metadata that comes from Adobe Photoshop and stuff. I can actually just go into Fiddler, pick any one of them, go to Image View, right-click and say, please PNG distill this, and it's going to run it. And it's going to cut it from 840K or bytes or whatever the hell that is to something smaller, okay? Then I can actually save that off and take all that metadata out. So we do this with JPEG. There's a tool called JPEG Tran, which strips metadata. But if you have metadata in your PNGs, it's a quick way for you to get a visual of which images have way too much metadata. Go strip that metadata out, and it'll be substantial. Like 85% of that one is metadata. We don't want to send that to a client. It doesn't help them. Saving and sharing traces. I talked about how to do it with a har file. You can also do that with Fiddler. So if I go back and run this again, whatever I have in my trace, I can just say save all sessions, give it a name. I can also password protect it. So if I send to third-party people, I don't want people to see all of our network details and IP addresses and such. I can just say password protected, type in a password. I can then email it to them and they can use it. And we actually have a lot of third-party vendors that understand Fiddler these days, so they can actually help us troubleshoot problems with their stuff. I didn't have time to show you film strip, but if you go in the network tab of Chrome Developer Tools, it shows you how fast your page is painting and how soon you can see things. So that's useful in the network part. Some quick resources. I do have a Fiddler course or a Pluralsight course on Fiddler, if you're interested in that. Eric had written a very good book on Fiddler. I've probably read it like 10 times. Every time I read it, I find some more stuff, so that's available. And then you can look at the docs for DevTools. And if you have any questions, that's my email, Twitter, and blog information. And I'll stick around for a little bit, and when the next speaker comes, we can take it aside if you have any particular questions. But that's all I had. I'd appreciate it as you walk out. There's a feedback bin if you'd put in your feedback. Green is good. Okay? So, all right, thank you.